Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And we are back. Thank you all for those of you all who have been viewing regularly. Thank you for joining. Uh, I had some business to do on the road, had to take a road trip last week, so I could not come on at my regularly scheduled time. So I am back today, and hopefully we're going to be able to continue on and roll right through to the end of our book talk. So we are reflecting on race, and we've been doing so almost for 80 days now. This is our fourth book that we've been reading through in reflecting on race. And the book that we are reading currently is White Like Me by Tim Wise, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. All right. So the last time that we talked about this idea of white bonding and Tim Wise's notion of white bonding, that white people who are racist tend to want to operate in a group, and they tend to want to drag other white people who are not necessarily racist into their world, into their conversation. And one way that they do that is by what he terms as white bonding, having conversations about a person of another race, or having conversations that are inappropriate with you, and then expecting you to laugh or to kind of fall in line to agree with whatever stereotype they are presenting. And so he coins that as white bonding. And one of the things that he says is that if you are not a racist, that is the kind of thing that you have to call out. That is the kind of thing that you have to let people know who are operating in bigotry and prejudice and racism, that you aren't a part of that crew, that you don't agree with the things that they are saying. And you have to be very blunt about it. You have to be very specific about it. Now, I may come back on later today and talk about the election and some of the results and what we are doing in our ministry, along with those who partner with us, what we are doing to address what has happened as a result of the elections. I may come back and do that today. I may not. But we are moving in an active way. We are moving in an educational way to help people to understand what is happening. How do they, address it? How do you keep your family safe? What are some things that you can do so that you aren't, just going around full of anxiety? We don't need to be anxious for anything, because our help and our trust is in the Lord. So he ended with talking about how whites have to actively resist racism, that if you aren't a racist, there's no reason why you should be silent at this point in time. There's definitely no reason why you should be silent at this point in history. You should be making it known that you don't approve of bigotry. You should be making it known that the things that have been happening in our society in terms of harassment and those kinds of things, you should be making it known publicly, out loud, that those kinds of things are not acceptable. Now, I am not one to go around saying, trash everything, burn stuff down. I know that there are people participating in what we would call riots. I don't agree with participating in riots. I do agree with protesting. And there are a lot of reasons why people are out protesting. There are parents out protesting because their children have been traumatized in their first week going back to school after this election. There are people that have been traumatized because they have been attacked unexpectedly by people who hold racist ideology and views. So I know there are a lot of people out there saying, well, George Soros is funding the protest. George Soros isn't funding everybody's protest. So let's just be clear about that. All of these protests are not simply happening because, quote unquote, someone is behind the scenes funding it. some of these protests are happening because people are being attacked in their own lives and they are upset and they don't want to be attacked further. We know, according to any of the previous readings we've done, we know that protests draw the attention of the world. But beyond the protests, you have to have some direct action, what MLK would call combined direct action. So what does that mean? It means I can't just protest. It means I've also got to add some economic embargo with that, right? I've got to boycott businesses that support white supremacy and white nationalism and extremist views. So I can't just protest. There's got to be something else connected to my protest in order for it to effect some change. Why? Because we know this country is run off of mammon, not money, mammon, mammon. Okay, if you don't understand the difference between money and mammon, go do some research, right? This country is run off of mammon. They respond to mammon, okay? So when you withhold mammon from them, then they will respond to your needs and your requests. So I do agree with the fact that you can't just protest, but you have to have some combined action with your protest. Otherwise, you will be on television, but that is as far as your change is going to go. So we're going to jump back into our reading for today with Mr. Tim Wise. And we may be just a little long today, but not too long. We should get done in about an hour. So here we go. Thank you for those of you who are coming in and staying in. And thank you for those of you who are just popping by, who can come back and watch the replay. He says, racism isn't the only thing that takes practice. So too does anti-racism. It takes practice and a consciousness of mind, the truth of which statement came home to me in an especially glaring way during the last year of my paternal grandmother's life. My dad's mom, Mabel Wise, was a central figure in my life. She was the person to whom I would often turn for emotional support when things got too chaotic at home. If life with my father turned especially volatile, it was to her and Leo's that I would flee, spending the night until things blew over. When Leo had died in the summer of 1989, my grandmother had begun to disintegrate. When I arrived at the hospital shortly after he had passed and saw her in the arms of one of his doctors, it was as even if then her system had started to shut down. As it happened, she would live until 1998, though only a few of those years would be of much quality. A year after Papa's death, while I had been home following college graduation, she had a car accident. It was nothing serious, but when I got the call to head to the scene, just a half mile or so from our apartment, it was obvious that the fender bender had shaken her up. As the years went by, it became apparent that she was in the early stages of Alzheimer's and had probably begun succumbing to the disease at the time of that incident. We would watch her grip on reality slowly slip away. It was a process that in its early years is hard to categorize because a certain amount of mental slippage is inevitable as we get older. Since there are still moments of clarity, there are times when you're inclined to think that there really isn't anything all that serious going on. Then you see the person on one of their cloudy days and they're snapped back into reality, unable to ignore that your loved one is dying and it's not going to be a pretty thing to watch. By the mid-90s, Mabel was still able to live on her own in the house she and Leo had purchased 4 decades earlier, but she needed considerable help during the day. For the last 2 years of her life, she relied on a couple of different nurses who would stay with her for several hours, make her lunches, clean up after her, and near the end, bathe her as well. We always worried that after the nurses left, she would burn the house down because she was a smoker, and in the depths of her growing dementia, she could easily have fallen asleep, cigarette in hand, and that would have been the end of her. In 1996, when I moved back to Nashville and was looking for a place to live, I had spent a week or so with her sleeping in my father's old room and witnessed the deterioration of my grandmother up close. At any given moment, she would have as many as 2 dozen open Diet Coke cans in the refrigerator, having started to drink one, then placing it back in the fridge after a few sips and opening another, forgetting about the first. She would repeat this process until she ran out of shelf space, or until someone, myself, a nurse, or another living relative, would pour them out. At night, she would forget that I was in the back room, and if she heard me moving around, it would scare her. So she would come to investigate the source of the noise, and I would have to remind her several times a night that it was just me. A few mornings when I came into the den to see her, she would be startled, having forgotten that I was staying with her. By 1998, her deterioration had rapidly accelerated. Seemingly at once, she began to forget who people were, confusing me with my father, and even calling me Leo on occasion. In July, she came down with an infection and had to be hospitalized. While there, it became obvious that she could never return to her house. Upon release, her mind barely functioning, she was placed in a nursing home on the Alzheimer's ward. She would live a little less than a month, dying 2 weeks before Christy and I were married. That a story about a little old lady with Alzheimer's might somehow be related to the subject of race and whiteness may seem like a stretch. But once you know the rest of the story, the connections will become pretty clear. First, it's important to note that Mabel Wise was no ordinary white woman. Though not an activist, she very deliberately instilled in her children, and by extension in me, as her oldest grandchild, a deep and abiding contempt for bigotry or racism of any form. She was very proud of what I had chosen to do with my life, and although her anti-racism was of a liberal sort that didn't involve an amazingly deep understanding of the way that institutional injustice operates, it was an interpersonal level at which she tended to think of these issues. It was nonetheless quite real. That she saw racism and rebelling against it as a personal issue made sense, because it was at that level that she had learned to deal with it many years before. Her father had actually been in the Klan while working as a mechanic in Detroit in the 1920s, and after moving back to Tennessee shortly thereafter. It was an association that would become a problem for her several years later, when at the age of 15, she would meet and eventually fall in love with Leo Wise, a Jew. Around the age of 17, she could no longer abide her father's racism, and that combined with his anti-Semitism, which she now took very personally, led her to confront him, to tell him in no uncertain terms that either he was going to burn his Klan robes or she was going to do it for him. I can't begin to imagine the kind of strength it would have taken to issue such a challenge in 1937, especially to a large man given to anger and hardly used to being accosted in such a way by a young girl or any woman. But it worked. My great-grandfather, having been given an ultimatum, burned his robes, quit the Klan, changed his life, and would later accept the man who was to become my grandfather into his family. From that experience, I suppose, Mabel decided that standing up to racism wasn't so tough, and she would do it again often. For instance, once when a real estate agent announced that the house he was showing to her and Leo was desirable because it was in a racially restricted neighborhood, she informed him that he had best get in his car and leave, or else she would run him over in hers. That's who she was, and had always been, so long as anyone could recall. Which brings us to the rest of the story, the part that provides the dramatic evidence of the way in which racism is capable of diminishing even the strongest of us, even the ones who have long made a point of resistance. If you've ever had a loved one who was suffering with Alzheimer's, you know that the loss of memories is among the more benign symptoms of the disease. The others are far worse, namely the paranoia, anger, and even rage that accompanies the slippage of one's mental faculties. As she went through the stages of illness that would ultimately contribute to her death, she began to work out the contours of her deepening crisis upon the Black nurses whose job it had been to take care of her. And how might a white person treat a Black person when they're angry or frightened or both? And what might they call those Black persons in a moment of anger or insecurity or both? Resisting socialization, you see, requires the ability to choose. But near the end of my grandmother's life, as her body and mind began to shut down, this consciousness, the soundness of mind that had led her to fight the pressures to accept racism, began to vanish. Her awareness of who she had been disappeared, such that in moments of anger and fear, she would think nothing of referring to her nurses by the term Malcolm X said was the first word newcomers learned when they came to this country. Though I'm not sure when white folks first learned the word, Mama made clear a more important point, that having learned it, we will never, ever forget it. It was a word she would never have uttered from conscious thought, but which remained locked away in her subconscious despite her lifelong commitment to stand against racism. It was a word that would make her violent if she heard it said, and a word that for her to utter it herself would make her another person altogether. But there it was, as ugly, bitter, and no doubt fluently expressed as it had ever been by her father. Here was a woman who could no longer recognize her children, had no idea who her husband had been, no clue where she was, what her name was, what year it was, yet she knew what she had been taught at an early age to call Black people. And once she was no longer capable of resisting this demon, tucked away like a time bomb in the recess of her mind, it would reassert itself and explode with devastating intensity. She could not remember how to feed herself. She could not go to the bathroom by herself. She could not recognize a glass of water for what it was, but she could recognize a nigger. America had seen to that, and no disease would strip her of that memory. It would be one of the last words I would hear her say before she stopped talking at all. Importantly, it wasn't just some free-floating word bouncing around in her diseased brain, which she was tossing about as if it had no larger meaning. She didn't call any of her family members by that word, even though they were the recipients of plenty of her anger and fear as well. She knew exactly what she was saying and to whom. Given Mabel's entire life and circumstances, her utterance of a word, even as hateful as this, says little about her, but it speaks volumes about her country and the seeds planted in each of us by our culture. Seeds that we can choose not to water so long as we are of sound mind and commitment, but seeds that also show a remarkable propensity to sprout of their very own accord. It speaks volumes about how even those whites committed to living in anti-racist ways and passing down that commitment to their children have been infected with a deadly social pathogen that can fundamentally scar the anti-racist who carries it, whether or not they are fully aware of the damage. Maybe this is why I tire of white folks who insist, I don't have a racist bone in my body, or I never noticed color. Mama would have said it too, and she would have meant well, and she would have been wrong. Watching all this unfold, it was especially interesting to observe how the rest of my family dealt with it. Whenever she would say the word in the presence of either of her two daughters, they would quickly reassure the nurses that she didn't mean anything by it, which was patently untrue, and that it was just the illness talking, which the nurses already understood far better than my aunts. While apologizing for racial epithets is nice, I suppose, far nicer would be the ability to learn from this gift my grandmother was giving us, and it was a gift. Her final way of saying, look at this, see what is happening here, do something about this. What those women at my grandmother's nursing home need and deserve, much more than sincere but irrelevant apologies from embarrassed family members, is an end to this vicious system of racial caste and the conditioning it provides to us all. Those nurses knew, and so do I, why my grandmother could no longer fight. For the rest of us, however, there is no similar excuse available. We don't have Alzheimer's, and yet we all go through our moments of fear, anger, and insecurity. It doesn't take a disease to usher us into those states of mind from time to time. We are all at risk, all vulnerable to acting on the basis of something we know is wrong, but which is there, ready to be used if the chips are down and if we simply aren't paying enough attention to the details. So what is Tim Wise saying in this particular section? What is he saying? I too have a grandmother right now who is dealing with dementia. And I know the last time that I visited her, and I know also when my other relatives visit her, that there are mainly certain people that she doesn't recognize. One thing that I find is interesting about my grandmother, who has pretty much spent her entire life serving the Lord, doing missionary work, going on missionary journeys, serving her community, is that she never ceases to talk about scripture. She never ceases to talk about the Lord. She never ceases to talk about prayer. Every time I have a conversation with her, even though she has dementia, and she doesn't, as he was saying here in with the case of his grandmother, that she doesn't necessarily recognize where she is, or even some of the people who are talking to her who serve her regularly. When I call her, there's not been one time that she has not said to me, pray for me, or remember the Lord Jesus, or I want to see God when he comes. So those are the things that are embedded in her subconscious consistently that come up out of her, even though she has dementia. And one of the things that Tim Wise is pointing out is that embedded in his grandmother's subconscious, no matter how hard she fought when she was healthy, when she was conscious, how much that she taught her children not to be this way or not to be racist, the reality is he was talking about the fact that racism has a ingrained hold on people. And in the case of his grandmother, he saw the effects that racism had on her subconsciously, even though she spent most of her life fighting against it. So that's one of the things that he wanted to point out, is the importance of actively fighting against something that is subconsciously embedded into their culture, into the culture of white America. Let's go to his next section, and then I believe that's going to end it for us for today. The next 2 years were defining ones for me personally and professionally. I started writing in March 1999 for an online commentary service operated by Z Magazine. It was the first regular writing I'd done in about 4 years, and I quickly remembered how much I enjoyed it. But at the time, I was getting nervous about the financial sustainability of the lecture circuit. Though I had never prioritized money, the fact remained that having grown up under conditions of persistent fiscal insecurity, I also knew better than to glamorize monetary struggle. There was nothing cool about it, nothing radical, nothing political. People who think starving for their art or their politics is somehow tantamount to making a statement have almost never done without, and they sure have never spent time speaking to people who had, and not one of them wants to be poor. Living hand to mouth was something I had more than enough of. It wasn't about to continue that cycle in a new family, whether it was just Christy and me, or whether the family would come to include our children. When summer came and I didn't have many speaking engagements booked for the fall semester, I panicked, thinking that perhaps it was a sign from the universe that I should go in a different direction. I applied for and was ultimately hired as the director of the Tennessee Coalition to Abolish State Killing, the statewide anti-death penalty organization. Unfortunately, almost as soon as I began working, I started to think I'd made a terrible mistake. I cared deeply about the issue, but as I tried to go about the task of running an office, coordinating chapters around the state, and paying bills, even simply remembering to pay myself on time, I started to realize how incompetent I was at almost everything but that which I had been doing the past several years. Literally, writing and speaking were my talents, and my time at TCASK would finally prove it. The organization and I would part ways in April 2000 after just 8 months. In part, this was due to my incompetence as an organizational manager, and in part, it was because my personal biography became a liability for the group. Working for them meant that among the condemned for whom I'd be advocating would be Cecil Johnson, the man who had killed my friend, Bobby Bell, in 1980. I guess I should have figured that those who supported state murder would potentially seek to exploit that connection in the eyes of the public and bash me to Bobby's dad. What kind of person, after all, would support the continued heartbeat of a man who had killed one of his good friends? When I managed to embarrass the associate DA in a debate at Vanderbilt Law School and again on the nationally televised Nancy Grace show, along with Nancy herself, who I managed to fluster to such an extent I thought her head may explode, it was clear that the only way to get back at me would be to call Bobby Bell Sr. and accuse me of using his son's memory to argue against capital punishment. This all because I had mentioned having lost a friend to murder when I was a kid, and yet still opposing the death penalty. I hadn't mentioned Bobby's name, but all the DA needed was an opening to discredit the far more informed side against which he was arrayed. Opening provided, and he took it. When word got out that pro-death penalty forces were planning on having Bobby's father make some kind of public statement against me, I knew that it was time to go. I certainly didn't want to put Mr. Bell through any more pain, nor did I want the group's important work to be harmed by my continued presence as their director. I prepared to resign, but ultimately wouldn't need to. A few days before I was planning on leaving, Joe Engel, the founder and board member, called me to his office and very graciously suggested that things were not working out on multiple levels. He was right, and I was relieved. By then, fortunately, the speaking engagements were starting to roll in again, but even if the money was going to be tight, I knew that that was the road where I belonged, so I began to go back to the grind. In October, we learned that Christy was pregnant, and we'd be having a child that coming summer. Though pregnancy becomes immediately real for the woman who's carrying the child to be, for the man in the relationship, it really doesn't fully register in most cases until the child is actually born. So although I was thrilled at the thought of being a dad, though scared, given my own lack of a real role model when it came to fathering, I had no idea how powerful the experience would be until our daughter, Ashton Grace, was pulled from her mother by C-section. At the first sight of her, I was overcome by the emotion of it all and literally dropped to my knees, tears flowing like water through a city fire hydrant after being opened by children attempting to cool off on a hot day, trying to make the world a better place and suddenly taking on an even more immediate urgency. Little did I know how much more complicated creating that world would become and how quickly. Knowing that the babe was due in July, I had cleared my calendar for about 2 months after the due date so I could be home with Chris and Ashton. By late August, though, it was time to head back out again. I far preferred being with my family, even though at that stage, Ashton was mostly sleeping and eating. Just holding her or getting up to do midnight feedings while Chris tried to squeeze in some sleep was like heaven to me. I looked forward to going into her room early in the morning to warm up a bottle and feed her. The sounds of Michelle Bitter album coming from the CD player just behind my head. By early September, I was to be out for the better of 2 weeks beginning September 10th. I was scheduled to serve as a visiting scholar at Poynter Institute in St. Pete, Florida, where several such visiting faculty were to conduct 5 days worth of seminars on race and reporting. About 20 journalists from around the country would be attending the session, where we would examine everything from how to productively frame stories on racial inequality to how to avoid inadvertently replicating stereotypes in print and broadcast media. As fate would have it, the timing for such a series of discussions could not have been better. The morning of Tuesday, September 11th, was a beautiful day in St. Petersburg. Beautiful skies, not too warm, a pleasant breeze meeting the seminar participants as we walked 5 blocks from our hotel to Poynter. We began filing into the main seminar room a little after 8:30, where we grabbed coffee and began to plot out the day's events. Each of the visiting scholars was to make a presentation over the next few days and then facilitate discussions with the visiting journalists when it was one of the other scholars' turns to present. Within a few minutes, though, whatever schedule we intended to keep would be scrapped. Shortly before 9 o'clock, Keith Woods, faculty member at Poynter, came into the room with a nervous look on his face and headed for the television. As he turned it on, I heard him mutter something about a plane hitting the World Trade Center in New York. Already the cameras were covering the smoke billowing from the North Tower, which had been struck by an American Airlines jet about 10 minutes earlier. As we sat transfixed by the tragedy unfolding in front of us, hardly able to understand what was happening, CNN cut away to a local station's coverage, which began with the tight shot of the damage to the North Tower, indicating a hit somewhere near the 85th floor of the giant structure. After about a minute of commentary and speculation as to what had happened, the cameras pulled back just in time for us to watch a new image come into view. It came into the frame so quickly and proceeded so rapidly, it didn't immediately register as to what had happened. Was that a plane? Wait, what? Another plane? As a huge fireball shot from the side of the South Tower, we all recognized that not only had it been a plane that we'd seen, but more to the point, it was history that we were witnessing. In all its horrific splendor, there was no question now what was happening. The odds of two planes accidentally smashing into the tallest buildings in New York were so ridiculously small that one of the commentators, although they speculated about the possibility for a few minutes, they were unwilling to face the terrible truth. This was no coincidence. These had been deliberate attacks. About half an hour later, it became obvious how deliberate, when yet another plane was reported as having smashed into the Pentagon, and an hour after that, when a fourth plane crashed into a field in rural Pennsylvania after having been hijacked. We all scrambled to call our loved ones from the lower level of the Institute, as most people didn't have cell phones in 2011. Patient but worried, we waited to place calls on payphones, many of us checking on people we knew in New York to make sure they were all right. Of course, it was almost impossible to reach anyone in the city in the midst of the chaos. It was all in the lines were tied up. I reached Christy and asked if she had heard from Wendy, a friend who had lived in the city and passed through the World Trade Center subway stop each morning about the time of the tower strikes before heading on a train under the Hudson to New Jersey where she worked. Why would I have heard from Wendy, she asked. I said, are you not watching the news? No, what happened? Just turn it on. Two planes just hit the Twin Towers. Oh my God, she replied, placing the phone in the crook of her neck and grabbing the remote. As she did, I could hear our baby girl in the background making the noises of a 10-week-old, and it almost broke my heart, thinking about the kind of world into which she had just been born. She would not, I thought to myself, know even 3 months without war. With Christy on the phone, my mind flashed back to our honeymoon 3 years prior, the first few days which were spent in New York. We had looked out over the city, taken pictures of the rest of Manhattan and Wall Street, a vantage point that no longer existed except in my mind. I imagined all the empty space below where we had stood, and below that, now lying stacked 40 stories high, millions of tons of steel, plaster, and human remains. I instantly felt nauseous. After getting back to the session, we all agreed that although events had altered the trajectory of the seminar, we would continue. No one was going to be able to fly home anytime soon, so we might as well get back to work. Not to mention, as media began to speculate about the role that Arab and or Muslim terrorism may have played in the attack, the need to examine the tragedy without fueling racial or religious bias became even more apparent. Several years earlier, after the bombing in Oklahoma City, Muslims in the area had been briefly targeted until the white Christian identity of the perpetrators was announced a day or so later. That such targeting could happen again was something about which we were all aware, especially given the magnitude of the acts that were unfolding at the moment. As a first order of business, we were all asked to write something, anything about our feelings in the midst of the attacks. Whether faculty or students, the assignment was the same. Yes, we needed to think about the professional implications of what had happened, but how could we bring an anti-bias lens to reporting at such a critical time? We needed to check in with how we were doing. Anger, fear, hopelessness, all that and more would spill out as we listened to each other's journal entries, poems, essays, and rants over the course of that initial day. For some reason, I couldn't write anything at first. Perhaps it was my unwillingness to think about the implications of what had happened, given the newness of my own daughter's life. Maybe I was just trying to think of how to say something in a way that hadn't been said already by someone else, even the writer looking for an angle. Whatever the case, I wouldn't write anything until late that night after watching hours of news coverage, hearing the inklings of war talk and massive retaliation against whoever was responsible, streaming from the mouths of enraged senators ready to use the attack as justification to drop bombs and demonstrate American military prowess. What would ultimately emerge would be a letter to my little girl, not really meant for her consumption, but spoken as if to her some later date when she might understand. It would be the most emotionally exhausting piece I've written to this day, and when I read it to the seminar participants, several of them cried as I did. 5 days later, I would read it at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro to a crowd of about 800 people, fully expecting to be booed from the stage for its open challenge to U.S. militarism, bombastic retaliatory rhetoric, and talk of launching a war on terror. Quite the opposite. The piece would receive a standing ovation from two-thirds of those assembled, signaling the support that some would proclaim that the nation's war plans were actually a lie. There were more people questioning the wisdom of that approach than many realized. Back at Poynter, Heidi, who had recently been hired by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a researcher on the far right and who was attending the seminar, said she thought there was something I might find interesting being said on one of the neo-Nazi chat boards she regularly monitored. Curious as to the take of white supremacists on the day's events, she had logged into one of the boards and started reading the posts. Almost immediately, she had come across one racist who praised the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon and said he wished that whites had even half the testicular fortitude to carry out similar actions. Billy Roper, head of recruitment at the time for the Hitler-worshipping National Alliance, whose founder had been the author of the Turner Diaries, which McVeigh had found so inspiring, added that anyone who was willing to fly planes into buildings in order to kill Jewish people was all right by him. Another chat room member said the attacks made him feel excited and more alive than ever. One after another, these white warriors expressed their glee, their unbridled exuberance for the mass killing that had just transpired. But there would be no news coverage of this anywhere. Rather, the media would show coverage from Palestinian West Bank, in which residents were seen cheering and dancing, as if to say they were happy about the death of thousands of Americans at the hands of the Saudi and Egyptian hijackers, whose identities we would come to know because the luggage of Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker, had not made it onto the fatal flight he boarded and would be discovered within hours. Of course, neither the Nazis nor the Palestinians had played any role in the attack. But whereas the media thought the celebration by the latter was worth covering, that of the former was conveniently ignored. It was much like the LA riots in 1992, during which a news crew had taken footage of white women looting designer dresses from a store, piling them into a BMW, and justifying the actions by saying, everybody's doing it. When the footage came into the possession of reporters in Milwaukee who wanted to show it on their broadcast, they had been blocked from doing so by their producer, who told them the footage was irrelevant since the story wasn't about rich white people looting, but rather angry black and brown folks who did. Soon the journalists who were at Poynter for the seminar started getting requests from their home offices to go interview the local Arab or Muslim communities in and around St. Pete. Go ask the people at the local mosque how they were feeling about what had happened and if they condemned the attack. One reporter from Detroit was asked to get home as soon as possible so she could go to neighboring Dearborn and ask the same questions. Realizing the absurdity of such a request, after all, she would note, they never sent her there to ask Arabs or Muslims about anything but terrorism. She had declined the request, as did everyone else, when asked to get local Arab and Muslim feedback. The seminar was becoming more than an educational experience. It had become a tool for resistance. This concludes the end of today's reading. What he is trying to convey there is the way in which reporting, and journalism is shaped. So I hope that you heard what he was saying. The fact that at the same time that we wanted to report about the response of the Arab and Islamic community, the white supremacists in America were rejoicing at 9/11. But that was overlooked, and nobody paid attention, and nobody reported on it, because that would have been a very, very, very uncomfortable and inconvenient story about the nature of white supremacy and linking it to the domestic terrorism that goes on in our country. How fitting, and tying right into the domestic terrorism that has been occurring the past week in our country, fueled by white supremacy and white nationalism. So that concludes today's reading. I hope that you will come back and join us tomorrow for our reflections on race as we continue to read through Tim Wise's book, White Like Me. Take care and have a great and wonderful Motivation Monday. Talk to you soon. Again, thank you for joining us for our reflections on race. I hope that you will join us again. Take care and talk to you soon.